Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Take a Lunch Break with Ben Chida. I'm so excited to see you all virtually via Zoom and certainly to spend this next hour with Ben. As you all know, I'm with the Campaign for College Opportunity. I have the honor of serving as president of the campaign, where our focus and mission continue to be to ensure that all California students have the opportunity to be prepared for college, go to college, and that when they get there, they graduate, and that experience is as smooth as possible and with the financial support that every student needs, so that no matter where a student lives, how much money is in their parents' bank account, what the color of their skin or zip code is, they can go to college in California and live out that American dream. So we're really excited to kick off the 2022 Lunch Break series with Ben Chida. I'm excited that we have broken records with over 300 of you joining us via Zoom, and I suspect many more via Facebook. I want to introduce Ben, and usually I try to be really brief on the bios because we want to jump into the conversation. But Ben, I just found your story so incredibly moving and motivating. Your trajectory to where you have, where you've gone and where you've come is just amazing. As many of you know, Ben Chida is the Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary for the Office of the Governor. He started as a senior policy advisor for the Cradle to Career. And prior to joining to the governor's office, he served as attorney advisor to then Attorney General Kamala Harris. He led priorities in education, juvenile justice, foster youth, and children's data. Earlier in his career, he served as a judicial law clerk to federal judges in California and on the DC Circuit. He managed the development and launch of the first humanities MOOC on edX, served as a third grade teacher in New York City, and has also worked as a roofer while attending Continuation High School and Community College. He attended Orange Coast College, transferred and received his BA from Cal, and also a law degree from Harvard. So Ben, I think you can absolutely relate to the experience of many of our students, and they certainly can look to you for inspiration and motivation. So thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. Before we get started, we actually want to know who's here with us. So you're going to see a Zoom poll pop up really quickly, and tell Ben who you are. We know that we have a lot of students, advocates, campus leaders, ledge staffers on this call, and we also want to know where you're coming from. We suspect we have most of the Golden State represented. So as soon as you finish that poll, I get to share some of the results. And be active in the chat. You can also put who you are there. And just want to encourage everyone to, when a question pops up, put it in the Q&A. My team is going to sort through those and feed them to me. We'll try to get to several questions, but I already know that I can't promise we'll achieve all of them. So we have a lot of higher ed advocates on this call, 46%, a lot of campus faculty and staff, 26%. And LA is well represented. A third of our participants are from Los Angeles, Inland Empire, Central Valley coming in at 5% and 6%, Bay Area at 22%, and Sacramento also leading representation here. So thank you all for joining us today. So Ben, we're excited to chat with you. Tell us a little bit more. I said a lot of things about your amazing journey. What motivates you in the work that you do, informed by that journey?
Yeah, so thank you so much. I love this as a first question, by the way, just because, in so many ways, whether we like it or not, our lived experience shapes the way that we think about things, the way that we see things. And I think my story is just really simply a reflection of the untold stories of millions of students, especially right now out there. And the unfortunate truth is that, it's just somewhat uncommon for people in policy to share the lived experience of those whose the policy is about. But there's a lot here. I'll keep it relatively short. My family life was always, a little complicated growing up, and it got especially bad when I was in middle school. We went through bankruptcy and in foreclosure, and that stress kind of manifested itself in my family and in me disengaging from school. So I had a rough transition from middle to high school, and I dropped out my freshman year. And like a lot of students out there right now, I felt like there was just no hope. I socially isolated myself. I closed the curtains. I spoke to no one. No one knew what to really do with me. And then around when I was 15, I started working full-time as a roofer, as you mentioned, and enrolled myself in a continuation high school. I eventually dual enrolled in a community college and transferred after 5 years to Cal. And after Cal, I taught third grade in West Harlem for 3 years, where I saw a lot of myself in my students. So, I could see the trauma underneath the student who was labeled bad, quote unquote, which is never true, by the way. I noticed the shrug of, I'm not hungry to avoid the stigma of getting that free lunch. I saw the shame in the eyes of the parents during parent-teacher conferences when their children need to serve as translators, just as I had to when I was a child. So a lot of the same shared experiences. After that, you mentioned a lot of things, a lot of more boring things. I went to Harvard Law School. I worked on the MOOC. I clerked for judges. I worked for the Attorney General Kamala Harris. I worked for the governor. I think what I take away the most from that lived experience, and I carry these experiences into every aspect of policy, is most fundamentally, and this is a rough diagnosis, but I see our systems and how they flatten and they dehumanize us in many ways. And more importantly, I think on the flip side, my experience shows me what's possible, which is systems that are all aligned to help people find and make meaning in their lives. And that's definitely possible. And we have a massive opportunity right now to accomplish that for our people.
How beautifully said. And Ben, you're certainly an inspiration. And you mentioned so many things that really inform this budget that the governor has put forward, right? In terms of support for transfer, in terms of investing in better career pathways and connections. I could say a lot more, and we will talk about a lot of those details, but I just want to ask you first, before we get into kind of the meat of some of the governor's proposed budget that was released a few weeks ago. And honestly, that brought me so much joy because it has been a lot of what we have pushed for and advocated for many, many years. But what are your top higher education priorities working in this administration?
Yeah, so I think the top higher education priority is to break free from the thinking around things being merely higher ed or merely K-12 or merely workforce or merely climate or merely healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. These things are all tied together. And that doesn't mean de-emphasizing higher ed. It really means the exact opposite, which is, in the first year, as you mentioned, before I was promoted to this current role, I was the senior advisor for Cradle to Career, which reflects the governor's vision from the get-go that we need to break free from these institutional silos that we've kind of set up historically over time. And so what that really means is better alignment with early childhood and through to K-12 and through to higher ed. But more broadly, what it means is recognizing and honoring the role of higher ed institutions as engines that power not only our future workforces, but power our solutions to solving some of the biggest problems that face us, the existential crises like the climate crisis. Like these are the things that we need to deploy our higher ed energy towards. And we are very intentionally trying to do that. So for example, in this year's higher ed budget, unfortunately, you can't just read the higher ed chapter of the budget summary to understand what we're trying to accomplish, because in addition to higher ed, we're doing things like, $2 billion for K-12 career pathways and dual enrollment. We're doing a $1.7 billion proposing in healthcare, workforce and pipeline for doctors and nurses and epidemiologists and public health experts and all these other folks that we absolutely need just as a matter of, keeping California thriving. So, that's all not even to mention the things that we're rolling out this year that we initiated last budget. So one of the things I'm most excited about is we'll be rolling out college savings accounts of up to $1,500 for every low-income public school student in California. Which will be an ongoing thing, which will be a game changer when it comes to not only access and affordability, but just, developing generational wealth and financial literacy and all these other things as well. So super excited about those things. But I guess in short, just to answer the actual question, our top priority is to really, like I said, honor the role that higher ed has, which is a central and necessary component to everything across our policy agenda.
Well, I love how you've made it clear that you really are the cradle to career guy with that answer, and that you're not afraid to take on the reality that we do see everything in a silo, right? Preschool education, K-12, then higher ed, then the job. Whereas, really, if we worked much more seamlessly together, things would be better, right? Because students don't operate in a vacuum in those systems, right? They go in and through them in a way that we should acknowledge. So earlier this month, the governor released his 2022-2023 budget proposal. We were extremely pleased to see historic investment of $39.6 billion in higher education that addresses many of the campaign's longstanding priorities, such as an even bolder goal, a 70% post-secondary degree and certificate attainment by 2030 for California adults, and creating a multi-year plan to grow enrollment with over 21,000 new seats for California students at the UC and CSU, something that we know is definitely needed. We documented it in our shutout report released last month. Can you tell us a bit more about how the governor will work with our higher education systems to ensure we reach that 70% attainment goal?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the things that we're most excited about. The governor wanted to make sure that we advanced and lifted up the attainment goal. To us, it's a push-pull strategy, which kind of aligns with what I just was talking about around cradle to career, which is to say, from the K-12 side, we need to push more students into our post-secondary institutions through dual enrollment, through clear pathways, and making it easier to transition so students like me aren't getting lost in those cracks in between the different sort of levels, so to speak. So for example, we need to, and we've got partnership to create an integrated admissions platform between the community colleges and CSU and UC. So, one is just, solving on the pushing end, making sure that we have a K-12 system that is feeding into our post-secondary institutions in a fluid way. On the pull side, on the post-secondary side, we need to pull more students in, and we also need to pull them across the finish line. So what that means is, you do that by drawing students in with more seats that you mentioned, but I kind of want to get higher level than just the seats, because what we're seeing, I think, across the board is a sort of a re-examination among many people, including and maybe especially students, about the meaning, the relevancy, the importance of education, just as I experienced when I was growing up. Why am I doing this? What's the point of doing this assignment, or et cetera, et cetera? And what we need to do is we need to present and pitch to students essentially a vision for their futures for their families, futures for the state, and careers that are going to be really, really high impact. So that means careers in climate, that means careers in healthcare, that means careers in education, because what that means, those are jobs that are going to be durable over time, where you can provide for your families for the foreseeable future. But on top of that, those are the types of jobs that are going to help us all collectively tackle the biggest challenges facing us, whether it's the next pandemic, whether it's a climate crisis, what all of these different things. And so to me, that is about showing how our interests are all interconnected individually and communally, and that in many ways, this is an opportunity for us to show people the relevancy and meaning of education, because it's not only to provide for yourself and your family, but it's also to solve our big, hairy challenges globally, really. And then finally, not only adding seats and adding that relevancy, it's about closing the equity gaps in terms of time to completion. So if you're asking how do we get to that degree attainment goal, it's about a K-12 system feeding into a post-secondary system as fluidly as possible. And then it's a post-secondary system polling students and encouraging them to graduate within a good amount of time. And I think all of those things are reflected in, the budget investments and the compacts and everything else that we've been trying to advance.
I really appreciate the attention on equity and the fact that you actually answered my next question about, the investments and the real commitment by the governor and your team to closing those gaps. So I'm going to jump to, to more details on the budget that I had. One of the biggest barriers to higher education, as you know, Ben, is the cost, right? Particularly for low-income students. So we were really excited to see the governor invest $20 million in one-time funds to supporting emergency student financial assistance grants to eligible AB 540 students, and to meet the commitment to create 170,000 additional Cal grants for community college students. But we know student financial needs continue to grow, right? And so given the state's finite resources, how will this administration really balance the proposed more than $500 million ongoing investment in the middle class scholarship initiative with prioritizing meeting the total cost of attendance for our neediest students?
It's a necessary and core question. To me, like, affordability is key, and we have roughly, our strategy falls into sort of three prongs or three buckets, as I would think of it. So the first bucket, or that first prong, is let's attack those underlying cost drivers that are increasing the total cost of attendance, the non-tuition costs, specifically around housing and instructional materials. So between last year's budget and this year's budget proposal, we're investing $12.3 billion for affordable housing and advancing dozens of policies to increase supply for affordable housing. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that a lot of these types of policies are sort of twofers, in a sense. Like, that those are the best types of policies where you can accomplish multiple goals at the same time. And our affordable housing plays that are often not considered in the higher ed space are ultimately going to accrue to the benefit of students as well, who are looking for more affordable housing. More specifically, to double click specifically on the higher ed side, we also are continuing our $2 billion commitment on an affordable student housing specifically. And that'll be another way for us to attack those underlying, like I said, root cause cost drivers. On textbooks, the governor has been driving on this for quite a while now, around the limiting and kind of making sure that the cost of textbooks and curricula are as minimal as possible, and trying to at least create a dynamic or a counter pressure, so to speak, against the continually rising costs of those costs. So on textbooks, we put $150 million last year to develop open educational resources, and to also have zero textbook cost curricula. But those are some of the sort of attacking the underlying cost drivers, because ultimately, there are underlying challenges that are driving up the non-tuition costs in the housing side and other areas as well. On the second, as you noted, we're also working to expand financial aid, and we'll be continuing that, as you noted, when it comes to both community college students and the middle class scholarship. And both of those are designed, again, to kind of add more on the sort of the financial aid side of the ledger, while we're attacking the underlying cost drivers on the other side of the ledger. And then third, we know these investments don't mean very much for students unless there's good execution. So that's why our compacts all include strategic objectives for each of the segments when it comes to affordability. So for example, our compacts include commitments and partnerships with the UC and CSU to create debt-free pathways for most students, to include student housing as part of future capital campaigns, and to also maximize the number of student courses that are zero textbook costs. So, for us, it's all three of those things need to work together. If any one of those things is siloed off on its own, nothing works. Unless you have, the investments paired up with implementation, it doesn't matter. Unless you are attacking the underlying cost drivers, it doesn't matter how much more money you're putting into it. You're just going to be chasing after an untenable and unrealizable goal. And so that's why we kind of think about it in this sort of multivariate way.
Well, we certainly appreciate, Ben, that there was real intentional thoughtfulness around leveraging what is a historic budget surplus in California and creating a multi-year solution, right? I think our frustration and challenge, I think collectively, not just as advocates on the outside, but I suspect internally, is that we do very short-term, year-to-year inconsistent investments and planning, right, that don't allow our universities and our community colleges to have the kind of predictability, and most importantly, our students, right, to have the predictability around financial aid, around the resources that they're going to have to serve students. So thank you for that multi-year plan of investment in the universities, investing in growth, but also investing in expectations that gaps will be closed is just truly historic, and incredibly grateful. And we stand ready to do whatever we can to help ensure that that is in the final budget. So let's talk more about some of the other proposed critical investments, especially in the governor's proposed budget to strengthen transfer. As you know, that has been a core issue for the Campaign for College Opportunity because students are really challenged. You mentioned that took you 5 years to transfer, and that's actually the norm. Not unusual at all, right? So there's 65 million in funding to support implementation of transfer reform policies, in particular Assembly Bill 928, which we championed last year and was signed into law. There's also 105 million in one-time funding to implement Common Course numbering, which is incredible, along with 25 million in additional funding to make improvements to the tech infrastructure that we know needs to be there to map pathways to transfer for timely completion. What is the governor's vision for the future of transfer in California?
Yeah, so as we've talked about, like I'm a transfer, I love transfers. Transfers are essential to the governor's vision. I think big picture, very few of us emerge as fully formed human beings at the age of 18, let alone much later in life, of course. But our current sort of paradigm when it comes to our systems is to focus on sort of the achievements of 17-year-olds and below, which strikes me as deeply, deeply misguided. Let's be real here. Our achievements in middle and high school are often more reflection on our family conditions than anything else, which is certainly true for me. I mean, I think true for almost nearly everybody. So I think, in addition, in addition to what you mentioned, I think that, to us, we wanted to make sure that we were centering on community college transfer students and others. In my mind, another sort of big element that we advanced here is around the Cal Grant expansion, because we wanted to make sure that we doubled down on the idea that there's not some point in time when everybody is ready for college and that you're going to transfer to a 4-year university. We want to tear that down as much as we can, because we know that for most students there's not a clear straight line path to a 4-year institution. That's not the norm, and we should have our policies very much reflect that. So, in addition to overall the investments that you talked about, there's also the Cal Grant expansion, and on top of that, our compacts also address this issue, and we secured commitments with the CSU and UC to make sure that transfer student enrollment was commensurate with the overall enrollment growth that we expect to see from the CSU and UC. So that's all to say, in addition to what you noted around transfer specific policies, we're also focused on making sure there's seats there. And then on top of that, making sure that people have continue to have financial access to financial aid, even though they might have taken a longer path than others. I'll even take one note on this, on that last point, or on the second point around seats, which is, it took me 5 years to get, through community college. Ultimately, I had a good GPA. I had a 4.0 GPA, but if you told me at the end of those 5 years, after all that work to get that GPA, that there wasn't a seat for me at a UC or CSU, that would have been the start of my supervillain story. I would have gone, it would have been, it would have just been so disillusioning. And I know that there are thousands and thousands of students right now who are in that spot, or at least they're anxious about being in that spot. So, I'm just especially mindful of our need to center not on some unrealistic imaginary paradigm of how kids go from K-12 to college to workforce, but rather see where the pathways actually are and to start building systems on top of that. I one last note on that, just to help people imagine, is like sometimes I think about this concept of like desire paths. So like how sometimes you see like let's say you're on a college campus and there's like the sidewalks where you're supposed to walk, and then there's the sort of diagonal shortcut through the lawn where there's a very clear path that people have tread across, and the grass is all dead and all that jazz. That is a desire path, is what that's called. And it's because what happened was whoever built that campus built the campus on the assumption that students would walk on these sidewalks in this way. And in reality, the students are crossing diagonally and going this way. And so I think big picture, to get a sense of what we're trying to do here, is let's stop building those sidewalks in these abstract ways, and let's look where those desire paths are, build on them, expand them, try to uplift them, and center around that, as opposed to some abstract imaginary alternative that we're stuck to sometimes.
That's going to be the charge for us moving forward, to do the desired path. I love that analogy. I think it's a perfect example of really what is happening, right? And sometimes we ignore the reality of the desired path. We start putting grass over it. We maybe rope it off. We do all kinds of things instead of thinking, okay, maybe we should pave that path and make it easier for students. So I appreciate that. And I really appreciate that what you just shared, you are doing in the budget. When you have pushed enrollment funding, you have said specifically direct that to high demand campuses, right? Because your earlier point of students, one, making sure there's a spot for them when they're transfer ready and they've completed all the coursework. We also know that a lot of students by that point are much older. They may already have children or families. They're very place bound. So it's less likely, right, that they're going to go from Los Angeles to the Bay Area to a university, or certainly, Los Angeles to the North State, or vice versa. And so we really need to make sure that there's regional capacity, right, for our students. So thank you for those investments, and really for pushing those impacted UC campuses that could be serving a lot more students regionally to do that. So we were also extremely pleased to see the governor propose 10 million ongoing investment in diversifying community college faculty. Staff and administrators, Ben, that, in 2018, we did a major report highlighting how even though 70% of our students in higher education are Latinx, Black, Asian American, minoritized students, it is very disappointing to see the low numbers of faculty and staff and college leaders that look like the students they serve, right? And how important it is for that. So really excited to see that. We also really appreciate, as mentioned earlier, your goal of eliminating racial equity gaps at the CSU and UC, and getting those commitments from those two systems. So tell us, how will the administration work with the legislature to hold colleges and universities accountable, both for closing those racial gaps, on completion, but also for diversifying? Unfortunately, sometimes we see those funds don't actually result in a more diverse process. So just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I would just, before I answer the question, I would just add one more supply side play here, which is that, UC, for example, is committing to increased seats for graduate students, and also to a 25% increase in graduates moving into education fields, which actually expressly includes the professoriate. As we were working with the UC and their leaders and President Drake around those goals, they were advancing themselves, and for all of us, I think, a big emphasis and goal around not only increasing the pipeline to the professoriate, but ensuring that that pipeline is equitable in nature, and trying to make sure that our professors and teachers and educators reflect the students and populations and communities that they serve. So just as a general note there, I think that, that's one additional play there. In terms of accountability, I think we'll be working, as you noted, we'll be working with the segments and with the legislature to develop accountability measures. But I think the bigger picture point here is the one that's really, really important, which is we need everyone here's help on all of this for years. This is going to be an ongoing plan and strategy where we need everyone here to be holding ourselves and all of us accountable. My old civil rights law professor, Lonnie Guinier, just recently passed away, but she used to say that, your best friends are also your circle of accountability. And by that, what she meant was, your best friends are people who are not only saying, hey, good job, you're great, or, et cetera, but they're also the ones who are pushing you to be your best self. And I think likewise here, what you see is a macro version of that in some of our budget and policy plays, which is an intention to create this ecosystem for accountability for multiple years over time. That's to say, a lot of our structural moves, which includes the compacts, which includes on the K-12 and connection side, the K-16 collaboratives, the data system, the Cradle to Career data system that we've launched, those are all opportunities and efforts on our part to make sure that people know where we're trying to go and how far we are to getting there. Those are the elements that are needed for all of us to hold ourselves accountable. At the end of the day, words on a piece of paper are only as good as how they're realized. And so that is all going to be dependent on all of us holding one another accountable. And I think that what we're trying to build here is a clear sense of, here's where we're committing to going in these time horizons, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. And it's on all of us, including the governor, including me, including everyone on this Zoom, to hold ourselves accountable to this. And I think that's one of the big things that's been missing. You've mentioned a moment ago, Michelle, the sort of lack of a multi-year plan. And I know that one of the, we kept hearing that every year was like, these one times are helpful, but it's hard because it's hard to have predictability and it's hard to create these ambitious plays without knowing that, there's gonna be funding ongoing. But on top of that, what I heard was, it is hard to hold anyone accountable when everyone could just point to somebody else. At the end of the day, they could point to the fact that they don't have sufficient funding, right? It's like every problem is somebody else's problem. Every problem is, and there needed to be all of us, including the governor, taking ownership around having to lead on some of these areas and being clear about where we're leading so that you can all let us know and we can work together to let folks know that, hey, we're not, pacing ourselves to get to the place where we expected to be in X years. So that's all to say, big picture on accountability. We'll work to incorporate that accountability measures in, but really, 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 we've seen this over and over with government and other institutions as well, is at the end of the day, it is the legwork, it is the people power, it is the advocacy that's going to actually ensure that people hold true to what they've committed to doing.
Thank you for that. So we're going to start taking questions from our audience. Just a reminder, if you have a question, to please drop it in here. The first question I'm going to ask you, Ben, is there's a lot of interest around Cal Grant in the chat here. So the governor and legislature worked together last year to remove eligibility barriers for the Cal Grant, like age and time out of high school, historic changes that address the point you made earlier, right? Which is that we've got to stop thinking about just college going in that traditional 17, 18-year-old mindset. So that's an invaluable change. How are you and your team thinking about financial aid in this year's budget or continued expansion to financial aid through the Cal Grant?
Yeah, so we've continued the implementation of, as you noted, the community college Cal Grant expansions and also the middle class scholarship. I think for us, we're interested in hearing more about sort of in terms of the proposals that are out there, interested in hearing more about sort of the ongoing fiscal costs and ongoing fiscal impacts. Otherwise, what you can see from us, like as I noted, is we're trying to attack at every level the problem. So not only are we trying to address, in our view, we could add on more in terms of financial aid and other spending, but then if we're not actually ultimately attacking the underlying cost drivers, we're just going to keep digging and digging and digging. So that's part of the reason for why we have this sort of comprehensive, what we think of as a holistic strategy on this. And then otherwise, for us, we know that there's going to be continuing conversations around how we expand on an ongoing basis. We're not, closed off to those conversations. For us, we are looking across our budgets, across all of these different things I mentioned. Oftentimes when we talk higher ed, we're not talking about the $12.3 billion for housing, but we all know that they're all interconnected. And I think for all of us as just people and voters and stakeholders, we also care about affordable housing and also care about universal healthcare, and we also care about climate and these things. So that's all to say, for us, we are extremely interested partners when it comes to tackling college affordability, especially non-tuition costs. I think we are interested in any conversations to have that advance that, but oftentimes we are in a position where what we're trying to do is trying to kind of map out across all priority areas. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier, we love 2-FERS and we love 3-FERS. Anything that is able to accomplish multiple goals at once, and you see a lot of those throughout our budget, that is what we're trying to accomplish, because we see those as opportunities for fiscal efficiency, but also for better alignment and coordination.
We appreciate that. So we'll be looking for more 2-FERS to present to you on that. So there's a lot of interest in the proposed shift to the hold harmless provision of the student-centered funding formula for community colleges, creating a new funding floor for community colleges and making that permanent. Are there any more details you can share on what your thinking is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of detail, I'm not going to dive too deeply into the details, but I think big picture, across both of this, and you see it on the K-12 side as well, we're going to be committed to making sure that there's not a fiscal cliff, there's not that both community colleges and K-12 schools, because it's also, we're seeing the declining enrollment and the enrollment instability and volatility across segments and sectors. So that's all to say, what you see in our budget proposal and what you could expect from us is a commitment to ensuring that our institutions aren't faced with a fiscal cliff. They know how to plan, and they're able to plan for multiple years, because we need them to deliver on these ambitious goals, and they can only be delivered upon if there is that stable funding. But in terms of the mechanics of how precisely the adjustments to the student-centered formula ought to move forward, that's really a conversation that we should have with finance and legislature and our friends at the chancellor's office, and all the different districts that are out there as well. So that's the big picture. As you could see on both K-12 and higher ed sides, we are very acutely mindful of the state of play when it comes to enrollment across the board in our public institutions. And we have every intent, and we will do everything we can to make sure that there's stability and predictability.
So we have another question about access to A through G courses in high school, and how we can ensure that there's real true access, especially for underserved communities. In a few weeks, we're going to be releasing, Ben, a detailed analysis on Los Angeles Unified School District, college preparation and going in the region that's supported by Great Public Schools Now. And it's actually really disconcerting to see that after advocates fought very hard to make A through G the default curriculum at LA Unified, and we saw exponential growth in Latinx and Black students who got the A through G courses, passed them, and are now eligible to apply straight to a four-year university, that the impact of the pandemic has really had a huge effect, and we're looking at 10% decline in A through G eligibility. Just interested in your thoughts about expanding access. And then I want to talk about the pandemic, because I don't think we can have a conversation without, recognizing the huge impact the pandemic has had on education, on all of us in many ways, both personally for those of us who have lost family members or who have watched family members deal with COVID, lost jobs as a result. So I definitely want to go there as well. But let's talk about A through G access. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the benefits of thinking holistically across systems, right? So like to your point, if we were all siloed up, it would be like, oh, well, that's a high school problem, like nothing we could do there. But rightly so, the campaign and so many people here don't think in those silo terms. It's not just a matter of, oh, that's a K-12 issue. We're not gonna have to worry about that. They're interconnected. They're the same problem. They're two sides of the same coin. So it's not helpful for us to distinguish between them. So actually, one thing that we were able to land in last year's budget, so it's one of the many things that we're excited to roll out and implement and drive from last year's budget, is over $500 million. I had to look it up while we were doing this, $547.5 million for the A3G completion improvement grant program. And what that's designed to do is to increase access to A through G and completion of A through G, especially among English learners, foster youth, and students who are eligible for free or reduced price meals. So, again, focusing on the equity element, and again, focusing it on not only, what can post-secondary institutions do once a student is handed off to them, but trying to get to that push side as well to make sure that we are expanding the number of A through G course available access and also completion, so that there are more students moving into our post-secondary institutions. And that's, I think, a good illustration of why it's so critically important to think across systems and not simply on one slice of it.
Yeah, what are your concerns, and what really keeps you up at night in terms of the pandemic? I know in the budget there's dedicated resources for re-engagement of students, right? Given the huge loss of students enrolled in higher ed, we know that community colleges have seen huge declines in enrollment across the state. What are other strategies that you think funding can help support? And I would welcome, I know we have a lot of college leaders and experts watching the Zoom. I would welcome you sharing your own best practices. I'd like to talk about a few that I've heard, but first, and it looks like my dog wanted to make an appearance on the Zoom back there.
Yeah.
But just interested in your thoughts around the engagement dollars and best practices that you've seen.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked this question, because my main job oftentimes, especially over the past 2 years, has been COVID response. So there's only been 2 days that I haven't been in office because we've been trying to actively manage the pandemic. And a lot of my efforts are focused, especially this school year, on keeping our K-12 schools safe and open, which we've done. It's been hard, but but we've kept them safely open, which is which we feel very good about. That's all to say, there's the immediate stress of the pandemic. So I know that this is felt also in the higher institutions, where it's across the board, we're being expected to all kind of be pseudo public health officials. We're helping administer tests, we're helping do contact tracing, we're helping do all these things. And the truth is, a lot of that is not sustainable over time. It creates burnout, it creates stresses, it's not manageable over time. And so there's a lot of discussion that we're having, and the governor's talked about it publicly already, that, and it's a global conversation really, about how do we actually create built to last institutions around making sure that we can manage the pandemic, and it's not on each individual type of institution or sector to kind of figure it out piecemeal, so to speak. So that's the sort of immediate pandemic concern. The thing that actually keeps me up at night is what I experienced when I was a youth, which is mental health. And I don't even know how to put it, but it's like it's a truly existential crisis in the philosophical sense, where there is a general sort of experience, I think, that a lot of us have, even in the workforce, but our students are especially having, around like, what is the point? How do I have, what am I doing here? How do I find and make meaning? How do I find a meaningful path for myself moving forward? And so I think, for us on the mental health services, one of the things I feel the best about is our youth behavioral health initiative. It's another multi-year, massive priority in the health and human services budget. It'll impact high school, college students as well. So just to give everyone a little bit there, it's a little over $4.3 billion over 3 years to essentially totally revamp our youth behavioral health system for 0 to 25, which will encapsulate most post-secondary students as well. But the goal there is to really, ensure there's this as much access at points of use as possible. So that's all to say, let's not force people to, like, my parents had no clue where to take me. They didn't speak English, didn't know how to navigate these bureaucracies. So they were like, Ben's in his room, we're very worried about him, but we don't know what to do. And so trying to make much clearer where and try to put as closely as possible the services to the points of sort of engagement that people have with our public institutions is one big part of that youth behavioral health initiative. Another big part of it is early prevention and early screening as much as possible. So on the mental health side, we do have things advancing to help address mental health and social emotional well-being, which big picture when it comes to COVID is probably my top biggest thing that keeps me up at night. But then on this broader issue of, finding and making meaning, to me, if you, I just on a side note here, which is like, I see the education systems oftentimes as sort of a series of conveyor belts. And when I went to law school, like the big injustice that I saw was that my third graders in West Harlem didn't have a fair shot at the conveyor belt to Harvard Law School. But then when I got to Harvard Law School, I realized that like all my classmates who were on the conveyor belts from Exeter to Harvard, et cetera, to corporate law or whatever, they were also miserable. They were conditioned to lead these whole lives to compete for status, the juiciest plums, et cetera. But that's a road that leads only to anxiety and disillusion. So I think, the reason why I bring that up is I think this is all tied together. It is about trying to align our systems to helping everyone, no matter trying to break down these ideas of conveyor belts and try to make it so that everyone has an opportunity to find and make meaning for themselves, to provide for their family. That usually means providing for your families and solving big problems that are meaningful to you and to society, that's what we're trying to do big picture here. And I think that to me also accrues to mental health and social emotional well-being, because it gives us a sense of, why am I here, and re-engages students. It re-inspires the relevancy of education in our students. And that's what we're really trying to do at the highest sort of philosophical level.
Thank you for that. I think this is a good moment to really just acknowledge the incredible work that's happening at our community colleges and universities that have had to shift to, providing education in an online format and pivot to that and do it, well, and still try to, provide those student services. I like that word that you use, the pseudo, medical service providers, right? Now administering tests, handing out masks, all of that's happening. And I would say also pseudo mental health facilitators, right? Because how can we address student success and improving graduation rates if we're not addressing the very real struggle that students are facing? I know we are all seeing that firsthand. So to all of the college leaders, faculty, staff who are working endless hours to do incredible work, we certainly thank you and appreciate you. And one of those college leaders is Keith Curry, the president of Compton College, who definitely added ideas in the chat box for how we could do better, increase transfer capacity for Black students at the CSU and UC, allow Black students who were CSU and UC eligible and denied access to use the Cal Grant to attend out-of-state institutions like HBCUs. Increase Cal Grant amount to $3,000 for community college students. Provide funding to each community college for Black student outreach and retention efforts. Equitize funding across public post-secondary education for lower division courses. Add race as a metric to determine the amount of funding colleges receive through the student-centered funding formula and student equity and achievement funding, and provide additional funding for faculty hiring, including a policy that supports cluster hiring for new Black faculty. That's a lot, and I think Keith has probably more really good ideas and suggestions. Brandon Pradas also says co-requisite support with direct enrollment in college level courses paired with multiple measures and math pathways are obviously great student success strategies to build momentum. Dual enrollment, which is also a priority of your administration, to really help break those silos between high schools and community colleges. Any reactions to some of those suggestions?
I mean, they're all important suggestions. I think that, in terms of like specifically with some of them, I think that they'll run into Prop 209 problems. But having said that, I think big picture, you see all of these within every element of our policy, including in higher ed. I think for us, equity is something that is embedded in all levels of policy. We just think, it's not a vertical, it's a horizontal. It should be embedded in every single policy. So, when you speak to sort of making sure that the Black students are supported by colleges to get to and through. All the compacts include goals to eliminate those equity gaps. That's probably the sort of, I would say, the central goal of the compacts is to close equity gaps in terms of getting to and through. And so that's all to say, big picture, totally agree with you. I would say equity is central to all of our policies, and then embedded with like both in the sort of deciding what policies to make, but then also once decided, you will almost always see a very clear reflection of equity measures within each of our policies. So loud and clear, and definitely appreciate the partnership. And I think that, that's kind of how the specific ones, like I said, there might be some trouble on the legal side.
Well, we appreciate that because I think for too long, even our progressive leaders have been uncomfortable with addressing racial ethnic equity straight on, right? And not just, putting it all under, broad, underrepresented kind of batch, but to say, no, what are we going to do to improve the success of Latinx students, who are the single largest ethnic group in the state of California, where there is no future without a strong future for Latinos? What are we going to do to support Black students? How do we disaggregate that Asian American data so that we can actually be thoughtful and support students in Southeast Asian communities and other ethnic groups who have college going and completion rates that are as low as Black and Latinx students in some regions? So appreciate your thoughtful approach to that and are grateful for that. We're gonna move on to my favorite part as we wrap. I'm gonna ask you a really hard question at the end. But before that, I get to ask you really easy questions. We call this the lightning round. So it's the first thing that comes to your mind and it's super quick. What's the first thing you do in the morning, Ben?
Oh my gosh. I check the news. I check Twitter. I check the buzzy clips, honestly.
You're still in bed, huh?
Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible wellness practice, but it's frankly what I do. I pick up the phone, look at my email, look at my texts, I look at Twitter.
I think a lot of us are there with you. What's your favorite binge-worthy show?
Oh my gosh. So I watch a lot of YouTube and I don't really watch too much shows. But when I was just telling my assistant Varsha about who I'm assuming was watching this, hey Varsha, one I love is there's this freestyle YouTube channel, this guy named Harry Mack. He's a Californian, which I love. And he just has really positive freestyle raps that are off the top of his head when he's engaging people and like, out in the streets or over Omegle or other things. So that's all to say. I binge watch that, which is kind of a very millennial move on my part, because I don't really watch sort of programming in a traditional sense.
I love it. We're going to ask Varsha or somebody to drop the link in the chat so we can all enjoy that. All right, Ben, Rams or 49ers?
Oh my gosh, I don't care about football. I'm sorry to everybody who's out there. I don't like I tracked Cal football when I was at Cal, and like Marshawn Lynch was there and Deshaun Jackson was there, and I was like, I love football. This is the best. But then after that, and especially after Cal couldn't get very far in anything really, I kind of gave up on sports. So I'm so sorry. I would say generally, I guess. I mean, I don't even know. Like honestly,
That's a very diplomatic answer. So that's okay. I have to say, I'm all about the show. The halftime show this year is. I was listening to the lineup, and I just hope that there's a Tupac hologram embedded in there, because that's the one thing that would complete it for me. Ben, what did you want to be when you were a kid? What did you want to be when you grew up?
So I had a lot of different. That's a really interesting question. So when I was 4, I wanted to be a taxi driver because for some reason in my mind, taxi drivers got credit. This is not even. It makes no sense. Not even describing it. I saw a taxi driver get a credit card one time, and I thought the credit cards were like forever discs of money, and so I wanted to be a taxi driver for a while. And then when I was like, if you asked me at like 8, my precocious self would have said theoretical physicist. I had no clue what it meant, but it was mostly a reflection of how obnoxious I was as a kid. And then yeah, I think from there, is my story suggests, like I kind of lost any sense of what I might want to do until I actually got back into the classroom.
I love it. Taxi driver and theoretical physicist. And only a taxi driver because you wanted credit cards with unending resources. I like that.
I started answering that question and I realized like it's like a four-year-old's logic.
I
that
love
makes
it.
no sense.
It's so great. What's the last best book you read?
Oh, interesting. I read so my previous assistant Stacy, who you might all know, gave me a book that I read around. I'm trying to remember the name, but it's by Richard Powers. It's his newest book. It is great. It is about a single father who is trying to raise his precocious young son who has learning differences.
Bewilderment.
Bewilderment. It was
Thank you,
great.
Charles.
And it's like so germane to this moment. It's about a father trying to raise a son who has differences in his he's just different, but everyone wants to like diagnose him with whatever, and then it's a reflecting on that and the relationship with our climate crisis, in the sense of disillusionment, in the sense of like everything's falling to pieces, and how do you raise a son or a child in that context. It's a beautiful book. Recommend it for sure.
Love it. Adding that to the list. Ben, thank you so much for this conversation, for your passion and commitment to California students. I feel so grateful to have you in the governor's office. I just want to end with the tough question. What do you want your legacy to be as Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary?
I'm going to go back to what I said a bit ago, which is, like, in my mind, I see these education systems, and my experience of it was these conveyor belts, and it's rough, right? Because it's like even the winners, who we imagine to be the winners of this crazy meaningless competition, where it's like everyone they're at Harvard Law School, and you imagine like they should be happy, they won the meritocracy, they won, like they got on the right conveyor belt, and they were miserable, and it's because they were never challenged or even supported in finding and making their own meaning. They were just told, hey, what you're going to do is go from Exeter to Harvard College to Harvard Law School to corporate law, and then that's the that's the deal. And So even these perceived winners who I looked apart, like I was like looking outside the windows at these winners before I got to law school, and I get there and I'm like, oh, you're not winners either. Like, this is really rough for you too. This is rough for everybody. Whichever track you're on, whether it's a track that goes from, the school that I taught at, PSV 25 in West Harlem, to, dropping out maybe to a sort of a job or a career that's never going to help you dig out of debt. And it's going to be just like a mindless grind in which people are just constantly pounding down on you and dehumanizing you. That's like option conveyor belt 1. And then conveyor belt 2 is like, hey, we're going to like send you into corporate law and it's going to be brutal. And you're like in a challenge, you have a existential crisis at the age of 30 or whatever. Like, that's rough too. And so my legacy, insofar as I could help kind of do my small part in advancing it, is to try to rethink our education systems so it's less about what others want our students and our human beings to do or be, and rather help them self-actualize, help them find and make meaning for themselves, and to really support them in getting there. That's ideally, in my wildest dreams, the legacy that I would want to have.
Ben, thank you so much. You've definitely inspired us. This has been a joy to be with you today, and let's do this again. This was fun.
Yeah, that was great.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next lunch break. Sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Ben, have a great day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.